are Pauline and Bishop. So debating on the motion, this house regrets the rise of nihilism in popular culture, calling in the Honorable Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Mr. Chair, the rise of nihilism in popular culture instilled a defeatist mindset on the people, which makes them disincentivized to go against oppressive structures, to go against and achieve their social political rights at the end of the day. We think that this rampant rise of nihilism in popular culture means that there's a rampant and rapid popularity like what we have back when Renaissance came into rise. We think that this kind of rise of nihilism in popular culture is everywhere. Therefore, we think that the power of popular culture is to be able to influence the mindset of all people on the ground, because people naturally consume these arts that the popular culture gives out to the society, for example. Therefore, it's important to characterize now what popular culture and what their power really is. These are things that are consumed by people, which influences the mindset, and art is not just all about aesthetics, Mr. Chair. Art has a power to influence and change the perceptions of people, to change and make people go against oppressive structures, for example, and have a revolution if it may be permitted, for example. We think that these are the doors to reality. Arts are doors to reality, and we think that the reason to fight back and the reason to go against oppressive structures, for example, is when you give the people the will to fight back to oppressive structures, for example, by giving them an optimistic mindset that life has meaning, that we should challenge inequalities, because the meaning of life is having equal rights, for example, and having to have like the value of feminism, for example, to have equal rights at the end of the day. Sit down. What we think that this nihilism these are concerns or sentiments that is a product of the ostracization of particular people in the society, because the system oppresses them and that change is unlikely. That is why there are nihilist people, for example, who think that life is meaningless, that life is purposeless and useless, because they think that they cannot change anything because of their defeatist mindset that is able to instill by the art of the popular culture. We think that this presence of the rise of nihilism actually instills furthermore to all people across the board, to all people on the ground, to have actually the same mindset as these defeatist people at the end of the day, which we think is harmful to achieving change at the end of the day and to achieving an optimistic mindset in life, for example. What is our burden in this debate? Our only burden is to prove to you why it's inherently and principally regrettable the rise of nihilism in popular culture, and secondly, why the consequences of supporting it does more harm than good. But before that, yes, go.
I think that's just factually untrue. The rise of protests in Chile, Hong Kong, and Catalonia prove that people are just doing that.
Hear, hear.
Okay, the fact that when you instill the people that defeatist mindset that life is meaningless, that they should not go against injustices, for example, because it's just a social structure. Anyway, we think that it disincentivizes furthermore, like movements, for example, like what we see in movements in Africa or Middle East, for example, because we think that the only way that you incentivize people to go against governments, for example, and to have protests or demonstrations to achieve their social political rights is when you inspire them with your art, for example, that is present in popular culture, which inspires them emotionally to relate with the problems in the society, and that the only way you can able to address it is when you're optimistic that you're able to change that system, for example, and that you can achieve the meaning of life, which is equality or all other kinds of things at the end of the day. We think that what we are going to prove to you in opening government as our case line is we want to restore the optimism on the people, and that's why we regret the rise of nihilism, because we think that it instills a defeatist mindset to the people on the ground, and we think that it's not beneficial to achieving social political rights that we long aspire to have at the end of the day. Firstly, in my discussion on the standards of when should we regret some things, there are two standards to this, Mr. Chair. Firstly, when it leaves oppressive structures the way as it is, and secondly, when it is not effective in effecting change in the society. Firstly, when it leaves oppressive structures the way as it is. This kind of popular culture in movies, for example, which depict like oppressors winning because people are not incentivized to go against them because they think that everything is just a social construct and it's not valuable. Anyway, we think that the only way you can disintegrate and challenge structures is when you actively recognize the injustices because of power structures and that you are emotionally driven to go against it. What happens on opposition side is that they do not influence and inspire people to have an emotional connection with the problems on the ground. Therefore, they are less optimistic that they can effect change in the society, and we think that's harmful because it leaves oppressive structures the way as it is. For example, if you think about like governments, for example, are autocratic in nature, if you instill nihilism in their mindset, you think that because everything is just a useless social construct, then we should not go against it because life is meaningless anyway. What is equality anyway at the end of the day if we're all gonna die at the end of the day? We think that this is harmful, this mindset is harmful because you do not actively challenge oppressive structures. If you look at the past, Madam Chair, the only way that you achieve effective change in French Revolution, for example, or any other revolutions in the past is only when a leader, for example, is able, or art, is able to inspire people to emotionally connect with them to go against oppressive structures. For example, if you go back to the Renaissance period, for example, for some arts of Michelangelo, for example, or any other artist, it was very inspiring and emotionally connecting to the people that they are able to instill optimism within their mindset, for example, to challenge oppressive structures. That's when they achieved independence in France, for example, or any other countries in the world. Secondly, on my second standard, on when it is not effective in effecting change in society, we think that the vulnerable people on the ground are left worse, Madam Chair, because we think that we need to consider the most vulnerable actors here in this debate. The people who are constantly oppressed, like the LGBT, like the blacks, for example, or any other like minorities in the social world, for example. We think that if you instill this nihilistic mindset to these people, the most vulnerable is the people because they're not able to access that social political rights at the end of the day. They're not able to gain equal treatment, like gays with equal treatment to men and women, for example, or women having equal wage pay with men, for example. We think that the only way that you can effect change in the society is when you consider the plight of the vulnerable and you consider what method is best in achieving social political rights at the end of the day. What we think from open government side is that you are only able to achieve that change if you instill optimism, that you give back the idea to them that life is meaningful, that life is about equality, that we should fight for our rights, for example, because we are all entitled to equal rights at the end of the day, and we are all humans regardless of any race, color, or gender at the end of the day. Second discussion, why it does more harm than good. We think that we need to talk about specifically to the individuals right here, Mr. Chair. Because we think that what happens on opposition side is that there's no tangible actions. People are just left lazy, for example. People are just left like lying on their beds, for example, and thinking about how life is meaningless. We think that these people are not incentivized to like be a meaningful members of the society, for example, to contribute to the progress of the society. And we think that it's harmful at the end of the day because going back to the vulnerable actors, they are left worse here, Mr. Chair. They're not able to gain the same benefits that other people enjoy. And we think that the only way that you achieve these social political rights is when you instill optimism back in the mindset of the people. We think that popular culture is very powerful and you should regret the rise of nihilism. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, to present that clash between opposition and your policy. Here you go. I'd like to start the clash by saying that the inherent value of life is a social construct. Governments use this to turn people into machines of productivity. Churches use this to manipulate you to serve a theoretical being that they have no means to prove actually exists. Corporations use this to sell you products for you to continuously enjoy your existence. So when we got shows like BoJack Horseman and Rick and Morty, or we got paintings like Salvador Dali's Melting Watches, for example, we think these are stories in status quo that counter this rhetoric that life has a straight line progression that may lead to a redemption arc, for example, or it's something that's going to pay off when you just continuously put effort into it, right? It creates a more realistic depiction of life. Like in BoJack Horseman, for example, there is no assured redemption story because you're not a hero, as opposed to all the various narratives and stories that you get under government without nihilism, because you're not a hero in real life. Kindness does not get reciprocated. The world shits on good people and benefits bad people. In Rick and Morty, the way they presented this is that the universe and multiverse is so vast that human life is cosmically inconsequential in the grandest scheme of things. We think Mr. Stiga and Mem's house, these are, even if it may not be the superior philosophy or life philosophy out there, we think this is a valid philosophy that they just abandoned on their government side when they remove the ability of this valid philosophy to stand in the limelight of pop culture. We will argue three things from opening opposition. First, that nihilism is an inherently valid philosophy. Secondly, it creates a clearer picture of life. And thirdly, the rise of nihilism through pop culture allows us to wrest control of our lives from governments, religions, and corporations. What do we mean by supporting the rise? This means we support the increase in the number of shows with nihilism as its core operating principle, for example. We assume that a bandwagoning effect may happen to some extent, so maybe in the next 5 years we will see more shows with this as a core operating principle. We accept that time may exist, right? But we think that risk that, so many people are going to be so depressed is going to be, is a mitigable risk. Because the media always has the incentive to create counter narratives, right? So you will still have happy-go-lucky shows like, I don't know, Pokemon maybe, or like Frozen or something like that. So we think Mr. Speaker and Mem's house, if your only value is creating inspiration from those kinds of shows, we didn't ban them in our model. What we're just saying is we allow these narratives to coexist side by side with nihilism. Our big institutions and cultural architects can and always will fight back about the theory that life has no inherent value. So we think the bandwagoning problem is not as big as they propose. But what we argue is, even if it does get countered eventually, at least we put this philosophical concept in the social consciousness, and the only way to do so is through its rise in pop culture. Brian told you that life has inherent value, but however, he skirted away from the idea that it's often these governments that tell you your life has inherent value because you are a productive member of society and your life should be to pay taxes, for example. Or churches use this to tell you that you should pay offerings to the church because the existence of your life is predicated on a higher being which you may not always agree with, right? We think these are the kinds of controlling mechanisms that nihilism seeks to counter. Anyway, as POI closing opposition, people don't automatically assume that life is meaningless anyway. Like, if I see Rick and Morty, I'm not automatically depressed, but it allows me a greater ability to reflect and maybe try to challenge maybe as the inherent meanings of life, so I'm not automatically depressed. But secondly, pop culture is just one facet of any person's life. So since they're not watching TV 24/7, they're probably also watching the news, talking to office workers, and all those kinds of things. This means there's an inherent check and balance to the issue of nihilism. But on the worst case, why we think nihilism as a principle is a valid concept. On the first justification, we think not everyone can gather the spirit to continue fighting, and we think we need their stories to be represented in pop culture, right? Because on the government side, the presumption is people should continuously be fed ideas that you can continue fighting in life and that you can always survive. We think a sizable portion of your population does not always feel this way, because in real life you do get shit upon. Even if you work so hard in the office, you may not always get the pay raise or be promoted, or some co-worker that tries to steal your thunder gets promoted instead. So we think Mr. Speaker and Mem's house, the idea that there is an inherent value for the efforts that you put in life deludes people into thinking that that is the case, and it sets them up for failure because life is inherently random anyway. So we think Mr. Speaker and Mem's house, under that principle, we think that the philosophy of nihilism is completely okay, because you have no way of determining whether the universe is completely random or there's a laid out story for you as an individual in the first place. So we think Mr. Speaker and Mem's house, what we proved is there's an inherent value in nihilism. So what government should also present is, why are the alternatives of presenting nihilism enough instead of just denying nihilism as a completely invalid philosophy? The rest of government should try to respond to that. Before second argument.
Okay, Sean, do you think that the conception of human rights is also useless and purposeless?
Here, here.
Those things are also social constructs. We provide value to them as humans, and that's how we function as a society. However, the difference with nihilism is your ability to challenge not the legalistic appreciation of human life, but as to whether or not life can be predictable, for example, Mr. Speaker and members of this House, whether it has an inherent story or it has an inherent redemption story, and that it's not random. What we present is the converse, which we argue is more realistic. Two arguments as to why the pop culture avenue is needed. Because if both sides eventually concede that nihilism is a valid philosophy, classroom discussions, which I assume is the best case under government, in government, is not enough because it's inaccessible. Like financially, you don't have enough colleges, for example, that teach specifically nihilism, Mr. Speaker and members of this House. So you, in terms of your ability to financially access this life philosophy, it's completely bounded. Or you have the boundaries of philosophical language. So even if, for example, you can't afford to go to a university that tells you about the core tenets of nihilism, you don't know what metaphysics means. So it scares you from actually trying to appreciate a valid life philosophy. So what this means is, the only way to present a valid way of life is exposure to nihilism, and the only way you can do this is by presenting this in pop culture, which is easily in swallowable form. It often transcends language because it speaks directly to your feelings. As a viewer of that particular show, for example, Mr. Speaker and members of the House, we think that's a valid stance for opposition to win.
Here, here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to point out a couple of concessions that need to be arrived in this debate that the opening exchange did not really follow. Firstly, we think that opening opposition's claim that nihilism is the ability for you to see the pros and cons is not necessarily true in this debate. Because firstly, there are other narratives for this. They haven't really proven why this is the only narrative that we should access. But secondly, it's been clear in the info slide that it's about seeing success and life ultimately as meaningless and useless, and that means that opening opposition cannot claim it otherwise. But secondly, we think that the fact that they tell you that, hey, it's the important thing about opening opposition is that they tell you, hey, it's about allowing this to propagate along with other narratives. They're not banning the narratives coming from government side. But we're telling you that both narratives of nihilism and positivism coming from closing governments are in direct conflict. This means that most people cannot consume one or the other. That consumers can only take one or the other, and if you take nihilism, you cannot consume the other. That's why you have to make a stand in this debate. You have to choose whether it's positivism or nihilism, and can't just say that you can allow the productivity of both sides, or you can't allow the production of both sides. But lastly, we want to clear out that coming from closing government, we think that this is not a movement debate. We think that it's unfair for opposition to necessarily try to defend the idea that they are in a bleak world and trying to fight for their rights. That's why we think it's a fair debate coming from closing government, that this is in a standard setting, that you as an individual, what's going to be your likely reaction once you are necessarily allowed to consume nihilistic art at the end of the day. But before I go on to my argument's point,
you're unresponsive to the fact that people have multiple facets that influence them, so it's not just one show. Furthermore, they can watch multiple shows, like I watched a happy Brooklyn Nine-Nine and feel sad with BoJack Horseman, so that's a very weird stance.
That's going to be my first argumentation. What narratives should be directly engaged, and that will also act as a direct rebuttal to opening opposition's argument that nihilism is a valid principle in this debate. I'm going to talk to you about the characteristics of nihilism in and of itself. Nihilism tells you as an individual that life is ultimately pointless, right? That life is ultimately useless, that whatever kind of success you have is not going to mean anything in the long run. That's why they show that Rick and BoJack, with all of their success and all their money, they're not necessarily happy at the end of the day. It means that you as an individual, you're no longer going to be inspired to do the things that you once wanted to do. I.e., if you always wanted to be a lawyer, nihilism tells you that probably even as a lawyer, you're not going to be happy at the end of the day. If you wanted to be a debater all your life, probably it's not going to mean anything at the end of the day. And probably that's only at an individualistic harm. But at the end of the day, we think that there's even a third party harm to this debate. I.e., you're always going to reach out to other people of your life, other people who don't necessarily subscribe to nihilism. We think that once you are a nihilist in and of itself, and the fact that humanity is interconnected with each other, your actions are going to affect other people. We think this is the fact that, for example, Rick and Bojack are always like hitching on Morty and Mr. Peanut Butter and making their lives more sufferable at the end of the day. We think that nihilists in and of themselves and their own existence are necessarily going to reach out to other people. People who don't subscribe to nihilistic values and are going to make their lives slightly different or make them inconvenienced or slightly what we call toxic individuals in this debate. That's why there is a third party harm into being a nihilist at the end of the day. That's why opening opposition cannot claim in this debate, hey, it's a valid principle because we're just minding our own business, because we have our own facets, because this is what we like. Because clearly, you as a nihilist individual is still going to harm other people at the end of the day. We think the fact that there is a third party harm present in an ideology such as this, we think that it's already invalid. We think that as a state and as a general community, we should regret its rise and we should accept standard values. Because comparatively, things like positivism is going to be much better on our side. We think that positivism values the ability to fight for something, i.e., no matter how grave your circumstances are, no matter how difficult it is, you're still going to fight for your rights. You're still going to be able to do these things. But conversely, once again, on nihilism, i.e., we think that nihilism is predicated on the idea that you're not going to achieve anything. We think that in the terms of rights or movements, since that was what opening exchange talked about, we think that once you have a nihilistic idea, it's also going to diminish your rights, because your rights are also about something finding meaning in your life, trying to do whatever you can. Once you have a nihilistic ideology, it's not going to allow these people the same kinds of rights. It's going to diminish the value of your rights as an individual. That's why we think that, once again, the meta-analysis of this argument is that it proves that nihilism is necessarily an ideology that suffers a third-party harm to other individuals, people who don't necessarily follow this kind of ideology. That's why second extension is incredibly important, because we tell you why certain narratives should be held responsible for these kinds of actions, or why we should stop these kinds of narratives because they have a third-party harm. We think the fact that these creators necessarily, even if they did not have any intent to harm these individuals, for example, they did not want any watcher to necessarily commit suicide or to stop work, or these watchers themselves tell their friends about it. We think that the fact that they are going to be suffering because of those initial values, initial viewings, is necessarily them having an active hand in the suffering of these individuals, in the suffering of their viewers. We think that nihilism can only be a valid principle if and only if opening opposition has proven there were no third-party harms. It cannot branch out to other people who don't necessarily accept the nihilistic values at the end of the day. Coming from closing government, we've proven why necessarily nihilism is an invalid principle, why it's going to shatter other connections, it's going to burn bridges with friends and multiple family members, why it's going to branch out to other people because you as an individual are going to be responsible to your actions and are interconnected with other humans at the end of the day. We've proven why even if it was a social movements debate, you can necessarily hamper the existence of your rights because of a nihilistic value. And lastly, we've told you why we should necessarily ban it even if there was no intent from these creators to have these harms, because it's still the same values that they wanted to propagate that necessarily made these individuals suffer at the end of the day. So that means even if there was no intent, you're still having an active hand in the current sufferings of these individuals. For all those reasons, I highly beg to oppose here.
Thank you very much, Member of Government, President Moving Opposition's case, Member Hall.
An old song by Rex Orange County has the chorus that says, I should just say fuck it and be happy instead. Because the false narrative of government side is the opposite of nihilism is optimism. I think the opposite of optimism is negativity. It is pessimism. I don't think that's the same as nihilism.
Here, here.
So if you read the info slide, it does not just talk about the existence being meaningless and being useless, but it also talks about traditional values being unfounded in and of itself. Albert Camus, one of the most popular nihilists, theorized that we can be both optimistic and nihilist at the same time. It is the recognition that there are no barriers to our existence that allows us to define what we ought to live our lives by. It is no longer defined by religious structures. It is no longer defined by corporations that opening opposition wanted to talk about in this debate. What are the things you're going to get from closing opposition? How will you delineate yourself? The first thing I think is the motion is a regrets motion, and you need to define what the counterfactual would have looked like. I don't think the counterfactual is what opening government says, that we will suddenly revolt and overthrow oppressive structures. The counterfactual that we will assert is to be true is the rise of nationalist rhetoric, the rise and the resurgence of religious conservatism in America and Europe. It is Hindu nationalists in India that are regaining its stranglehold on the people. There are social oppressive structures such as this that will rise and continue to rise unchecked if you don't have an equally powerful rise of populism, of nihilism in its place. I think that nihilism is not a prescription and instruction of how to live your life. It is a frame of questioning the values and the inherent importance of anything that is fed into your life. So that means you are more likely to question the values of this religious conservatism. You are more likely to resurge the nationalist rhetoric. Why is this important? In a world full of fake news and social media marketing, we are inherently defenseless to the active marketing strategies of populist leaders and religious rhetoric and even Russian intervention in our election. I think that for individuals to re-empower their choices and their capacity to regain control of their life, we need a frame of thought and ideology that seeks you to question these types of things. And I think nothing can compare to nihilism. If opening government was right, that nihilism is so influential, I think that is the perfect world in which people don't just succumb to the oppression that exists under either model of this side. So I think on the first thing, the counterfactual would have been much worse. The right at least one gets us to a point in the future where we are likely to increase the amount of questioning rather than constantly buying it. I think Hegel was also right. In a world with thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, it is nihilism that provides an antithesis to the institutional structures that provide and fed us through historical amounts of theses. I think the eventual synthesis in the future is us actively questioning these things. I don't think the outcome is one that is either good or bad. It is not clear that the outcome will be overthrowing everyone, because I think it is still legitimate for us to still choose populist leaders. I think it is perfectly fine in a world with nihilism because at least your choice was valid. And this is my second extension. Why? We therefore empower people to consent to the structures that they are placed into rather than them being pushed into the structures that they currently live in. I think this is a better world. Closing up government was value neutral in this debate. They say that nihilism has third-party harms to your best friends. Realize religion has third-party harms to gay people. Populism has third-party harms to people who do not support that populist leaders. But I think what is clearly a value here is the capacity for individuals to consent to these structures. I think that's more important in nihilist perspective. What are the two standards when you get clear consent? Two things. One, you get a more informed choice and you have alternatives presented to you. I think in the world and the counterfactual, the only narrative presented to you is one of religious nationalism or hyper-conservatism. Nihilism presents to you an alternative. The second thing is, I think at least now our choices are more freely given. We are not fear-mongered into believing into the nationalist rhetoric, but we are opting into these nationalist rhetorics because we have initially questioned it by the frame of mind of nihilism. I think this is preferable for a number of reasons. One, nihilism and the choices by which people make are personal experiences, unrelated and unreliant to outside perspectives. Realize that any outside source of influence is a meaning that was constructed by someone else. We would rather that people personally construct the meaning by which they choose to live their life rather than choosing what other people feed onto them. Second, I think this means people are more accountable to their actions because I consented to this rather than Duterte told me to consent to this. I think that is a more preferable world in which nihilism frames the way by which people think to actively question before they opt into the types of things that they currently live as oppressive structures. Second, I think that's important in giving people hope. Because when you don't have the capacity to choose, or you feel like you're just being pushed in a particular direction, that's where you're more likely to get the helplessness of opening government in this debate. Yes?
In your best case, consider that people will question, but you haven't proven that's mutually exclusive. But secondly, if people will think that their actions are going to be useless at the end of the day, what is the likelihood that they're going to pursue those actions in favor of your movement?
Okay.
For example,
So I will first deal with the whole, is it mutually exclusive? The counterfactuals that opening government and closing government said is we will have other sources of media that will cause us to revolt against government. What does that media likely look like? It looks like us revolutionizing or throwing anger at government versus the actual reality of how it is portrayed. Nihilism is not BoJack Horseman choosing to die. It is BoJack Horseman raging against the dying and meaninglessness of his life. It is Rick actively waking up every day to create a new adventure for himself rather than dying and killing himself. I think this is important because the narratives that are likely to exist on their best case are media that encourages people to actively revolt against the government. That is difficult because people cannot always take up arms against the government. The fear of them having to fight against governments are too big versus, or even governments are likely to filter revolutionary content because they don't want to stoke revolutions. The subtleness of nihilism as a frame of mind, one, does not require direct action, but it requires direct thought. And the thought is important in the other structures that still exist, like voting, like referenda, that I think people can change microaggressive behaviors in their own lives by choosing smaller actions rather than the grand scheme of revolutions under their side. It is therefore more accessible as nihilism as a counter-narrative to oppressive structures rather than revolutionary media that requires a high barrier of entry. I think the personal accountability and the consent that people are empowered to make under our side is only exclusive by the popular media that is rising against oppressive structures such as populism and religious conservatism. Proud of this.
Thank you very much, member of opposition. Close government's debate. Government.
the first thing I have to do is to call out closing opposition's counterfaction against us as extremely unfair. Because he said, if we don't want positivism, if we don't want the idea of making individuals really positive about their lives, our necessary counterfaction should be all about that we should ensue oppressive structures. This is so weird and unfair, ladies and gentlemen, because you cannot expect government bench to defend that people become automatically dumb, that when nihilism is absent, we will automatically believe religion is good and therefore oppression is justified, right? We suggest absent nihilism, as an individual, even if you don't have nihilism, you have the moral conception of what is good and bad, which means even if you don't have nihilism, you know religious oppression is inherently bad by nature, ladies and gentlemen. You don't need this particular strategy for you to be able to understand that religious oppression is so bad at all, ladies and gentlemen. If this debate is all about how do we best challenge the structures, I will compare later on why this nihilism is not the best way to go, ladies and gentlemen. The second clarification I have to make is that the idea of life being meaningless and it is perfectly valid is only good at face value if you look at opposition's bench characterizations. I know that as like debaters, we have been accepting of radical concepts like this, and as a woke individual, this rhetoric is so enticing. But as much as we want to accept this, ladies and gentlemen, because of our liberal nature as individuals, we have to ground this debate in the social realities. Discrimination is so real. That's why if opening government talks about movements debate, which is by the way not really a debate at all, but this debate is all about how nihilism affects individual level, closing government entering this debate by talking about how your individualistic actions affect humanity as a whole, and therefore humanity is being compromised because humanity is interconnected as a necessary nuance coming from closing government. We have to do something about it because in reality, your action as an individual affects others, ladies and gentlemen, as an exclusive contribution coming from closing government. That's why this debate is all about assessing the justification of this particular narrative. That's why the issue is all about is regretting nihilism justified. Let's first discuss what opening opposition talked about in this debate, because their only battle cry is that value of life is socially constructed, and therefore it is perfectly valid for individuals to consent, which is by the way the same justification of Papa in this debate. The first question we have to ask in this particular argumentation is that why is this necessarily bad? Because we say that's not a harm right away, Mr. Speaker, just because it is state endorsed. Notice it down. Absent the liberal bias, value of life as a narrative is still objectively good. When you study as a student, for example, it's for your own good, ladies and gentlemen, because you need to get a job in the future. If you need a job to eat 3 times a day, that is vital for your survivability, which is, by the way, a basic need for individuals. Or if you have to pay taxes, it creates infrastructures and goods and services to help the most vulnerable individuals, which are the poor individuals. What is the implication of this rebuttal? The endorsement of value of life is not one-sided only to the state, but it is also a benefit to you. There's a mutual benefit to alleviate you from horrendous living conditions, ladies and gentlemen. And why is it so important coming from closing government? Because the only time we absolutely endorse the pessimistic ideology of nihilism is when it only brings harm right away, right? But what we suggest is that it's not, because our idea is that it's valid to endorse that value of life as well. That's why Ben was so important in this debate, because our characterization does not just like limit into movements debate, but it's more of an internalized kind of justification as to how if opening opposition's debate is about opening opposition's debate about value of life, we say it being meaningless is invalid because Ben argued perfectly how nihilism, ladies and gentlemen, affects on the individual level on how they act in society, affecting other people, creating third-party harms, ladies and gentlemen. And why is it so important as an extension coming closing government? Because as a humanity, we are interconnected. So commonsensically, if you do something that is so bad, it will also harm other individuals in the process, ladies and gentlemen. Note it down. I.e. the final characterization coming from Ben when he talked about if you don't pay taxes, because Sean is so against the idea of paying taxes, but the poor will also be benefited from it, ladies and gentlemen. And it's absent on their side if you say nihilism is about not doing anything about it and not paying taxes at all. That's why this particular policy, this particular narrative as being regretted is not valid to endorse, ladies and gentlemen, or nihilism is not valid to endorse because of this third-party harms of closing government's extension exclusively. Note it down. So what is Papat's response? He just glibly said our extension is value neutral because he claims our counterfactual also has third-party harms because we defend religious conservatism. Look, we already say it's invalid because that is not our counterfactual, so that's not a valid rebuttal against our extension. Because as we clarified, we never defended religious oppression as justified, so we suggest he never responded to the core principle of third-party harm of nihilism in his debate, ladies and gentlemen. Before I proceed, closing.
Shame.
In a regrets debate, you have to prove why the counterfactual is likely to be on your side. It is clearly true that populism and religious nationalism is the thing that is rising. We need a counter-narrative. This is nihilism.
Okay, fine. If the counterfactual is like religious oppression and all those things, and if you say that we should have a counter-narrative, then we suggest our counter-narrative is not justifying religious oppression, but there's another counter-narrative, which is, by the way, positivism. So we suggest it's still valid in this debate. But more than that, if closing opposition talks about multitudes of narratives, and opening opposition also sharing this idea that people can can also understand and widen their understanding that we have to assess different types of ideology, and if they're able to assess different types of ideologies, they're able to assess their own personality. This strategy doesn't help opposition in this debate because this claim is super soft. Why? Because if your claim is that it's beneficial to have nihilism, to have as an option for individuals to assess your identity, no, still not anymore, is like a pessimistic perception, the first criticism is that then, if you were able to prove that the value you get from nihilism can be found in other types of philosophies, nihilism doesn't have any exclusive value at all, ladies and gentlemen, for it to be supported to begin with. So what is the point of this particular rebuttal? We say the value of creating realistic expectations, because that is the end outcome of opposition bench. If you allow nihilism, there will be realistic expectations, because you also preempt the worst case of your actions. We suggest the idea of being realistic with your expectations can also be found in other types of philosophies, like realism, where you just have to be realistic about the situation. You're still able to weigh the social reality of harms and benefits. So what is the implication of this rebuttal coming from opposing government? Nihilism doesn't have any value right now, because its value is not exclusive at best. But the difference you provided coming from opposing government exclusively is that when you talk about life as it being meaningless, ladies and gentlemen, you feel it is not necessary for you anymore to question about its values, because you suggest that life doesn't have to have any value at all, and therefore should not be questioned anyway, ladies and gentlemen, because you suggest your life is just secondary right for your individuality in that case, ladies and gentlemen. So why is closing government take this debate over opening opposition? Because if their case is about value of life, we already successfully proven why this type of definition should be not endorsed by the state or the society as a whole because of third-party harms. But lastly, if closing opposition's debate is about being able to make individuals realistic with their expectations, those things are not mutually exclusive. It can be pointed others. They never respond to their worst case. They just try to deny and deny without having an even analysis. Thank you so much.
You're here.
Thank you very much, Government Whip, to finally end this debate. Opposition. Here, here.
It's quite depressing that the affirmative bench starts their case with the problem of depression and then ends up with the solution of depression, because they never explain to us how people are going to be happy on their side. They just said that this is what people are supposed to do, this is what they should go through, and it's good for them. Like, I don't understand why this is supposed to be good for them, or like, it's ultimately what they want in the first place. That's why we think it's important for nihilism to exist, because you need to allow people to be devoid of all the oppressive options that are given to you, people telling you what you should do with your life, just so that you could move on. And it's important for them because that's how you essentially become a better person yourself later in the future. That's why Papa's discussion was particularly important both on a social political level and on an individual level. So there are two questions I want to answer in this debate. First question is, how does nihilism affect our ability to question oppressive structures? And second, how does nihilism affect our individual worth, or in which model do we become happier people? First is, how does nihilism affect our ability to question oppressive structures? And the first clarification is that we want to point out that nihilism isn't the opposite of optimism. Optimism is the opposite of it is negativism or pessimism. Because there is such a thing as an optimist nihilism, as discussed by Papa in this debate. But the crux of opening government's argumentation is this: nihilism promotes the defeatist mindset that prevents protests, and that you need to carry a positive and optimistic attitude to question oppressive structures and realize that life has meaning. Now, first is, this assumes that nihilism creates that defeated mindset that they think is existing in the status quo. We think that it is the state that employs extreme violent measures and propaganda that defeats actual protests that are actually happening on the ground. Their argument is based on a false premise. As a matter of fact, protests do continue to rise, no matter how much they're constantly defeated and beaten down by the state. The motivation for people to fight back is still there. The fact that they are constantly defeated doesn't automatically mean that they become defeatists. because there's a difference, Mr. Chair, between those particular definitions. Sit down. The second thing is that their case line assumes that the meaningfulness of life is solely dictated by our ability to question oppressive structures. Like, why is it even our obligation of people to turn themselves into social battering rams and sacrifice their lives for some sense of social justice? Because this in itself is an imposition of a particular way of life that might not make them happy. People weren't just born to become rebels, they were also born to become parents, musicians, or maybe people who are just couch potatoes who just don't want to earn a decent living because they're better off, strumming their guitar at some shore at a faraway island. Like, I don't understand why this is the only thing that's meant to make people happy. Sit down, both of you. This is where closing opposition's discussion of the rise of nihilism was important, because we told you that the counterfactual has always been the rise of conservatism, the idea that there's fake news that's proliferating already, the fact that we already have the modern day KKK, i.e. the white supremacists who are fighting for white straight pride rights. Mr. Chair, they're coming back and shoving traditional values under people's asses in the ways that they don't enjoy. We think, Mr. Chair, that this is the kind of counter-narrative and the narrative that we need to counter with the same level of intensity as and that thing comes in the form of nihilism. Because if opening opposition talked about how positivism is a social construct and that nihilism is a valid view, we think that the message from closing opposition is that the message of nihilism is a more strategic way of instilling the constant questioning of oppressive regimes and to be able to have a good life. This is where we told you, because there was a questioning coming from the closing government with respect to the counterfactual being positivism. They never proved to us how positivism would have the same capacity to be able to rise up and counter the already existing problem that exists in the status quo. Because first of all, we told you that the good thing about nihilism is that it gives individuals the capacity to make the choices their own, and so that no matter what happens, they're essentially still happy anyway. Because the thing about nihilism is that it essentially clears out all the socially constructed options that are created for you and allows you to customize and make options of your own. You are then able to make choices that are devoid of fear. The non-existence of meaning allows you to be able to create meanings of your own, Mr. Chair, and that's what makes you ultimately happy and allows you the informed choice that is in its perfect form. Secondly, it's no longer limited to the options that are already constructed by society. But secondly, on a macro scale, we also told you that the thing about positivism, counter-propaganda or revolutions, Mr. Chair, is what further endangers individuals who want to question the oppressive structures, because it's too risky in a sense that counter-propaganda elicits reactions and retaliations on the part of the state. What nihilism does, Mr. Chair, is that it creates a void and a meaning and allows people to subtly question the traditions that exist on the status quo, and that instills in the minds of individuals who get to live on, as well as the future generations that they will be able to influence in the future. That's how you keep people constantly questioning the existing structures in the status quo. Before I continue, yes?
If we have optimistic nihilism, the value of questioning and challenging oppressive structures also exists in realism and positivist which is realistic. Your birthright doesn't prove the exclusive value of your clash.
No, they're the ones with the problem of how they define nihilism and how it relates to positivism in the first place. So that's not really the burden coming from closing opposition. We think that what we simply need to do is we need to show to you how the idea of meaninglessness allows people and further enables them to be able to live their lives in the way that is good for them. Second issue is how does nihilism affect our individual worth? Now there's this discussion coming from closing government about how that you need to do stuff in this world because there's a third party harm. Like being a debater for all your life is something that's harmful, gonna affect other people. First of all, this is not mutually exclusive to nihilists as a whole. I am not a nihilist, but I'm debating my whole life, right? It's not even religious institutions and other people and conservatives can discriminate people too. So third party harm is not a legitimate standard. But even if we assume that's the case, this assumes that other people are meant to be our priority. The idea that we have to be able to spend all our money to pay taxes for the poor. And this is the problem because they're themselves that are affirming the idea that people are meant to live a specific way of living, no matter how miserable you are, no matter how unhappy you are. They're the ones that are forcing you to live in a particular way, that are affirming the oppression that you're experiencing. The government whip says that you need to do certain things because it's for your own good. Like, we don't care if you starve to death, if it means that every day you have to live a job that is miserable, that constantly tries to hurt you and abuse you. Like, even if you have a good reason to live your life, then you'll probably have a natural incentive to feed yourself. But otherwise, if you're gonna wake up in the morning knowing that there's nothing out there for you, we think that that's still a good thing. At least those are choices that you make your own. That's something that is customized for yourself. That is exactly, Mr. Chair, how we think people are able to truly live.
Thank you very much for your We might go on the team to be the speaker's position.